We usually imagine that the threats to our society are external threats, and basically a comet hitting the Earth, volcano outbreaks, hurricanes, and other kinds of problems. But this is kind of an outdated picture because there are new threats, and these threats are characterized by systemic instabilities, such as financial and economic crisis, social and political instabilities, or climate change, environmental change, organized crime, also the spreading of emerging diseases. These are all global problems, and so how to go about them? I'd like to start with two quotes from US colleagues. Sandy Bennett once said, "Our financial, transportation, health system are broken." And Geoffrey West, the former president of the Santa Fe Institute, once said, "We're seeing an extraordinary failure of our current political and economic system." That was during the financial crisis. These kinds of problems are actually very expensive to our societies. And the question is, can we afford them? Do we want to afford them? Or can we come up with better solutions fueled by science and technology? And for this, we need to understand better the systems that are causing these kinds of problems. And these are complex systems. That means systems that are made up of many non-linearly interacting components which adapt to each other and create a complex dynamics that often creates new properties, emergent properties, and surprising behaviors. Take pedestrian flows. So my computer is under external control. Unfortunately, the movie is not working. But what we would see out in real life is that there is a self-organization of pedestrians into uniform lanes of walking direction. So different directions are separated from each other, and it happens like magic, as if there was an invisible hand. Social order is created automatically by local interactions. But we also know that when the densities exceed certain levels, social order can break down, and we can see terrible crowd disasters where people are dying even though nobody has any aggressive intentions. So how can these things happen? And that can be understood better with an example like this, which is demonstrating circular traffic flow. You can find this movie on the web and also in our YouTube channel. It's also not playing here, unfortunately. So what we would see is that after a very short time, the circular flow is breaking down. We call that a phantom traffic jam. And if you would ask drivers what has happened, they would probably say, there was a stupid driver in front of me who didn't know how to drive a car. But we know it better. There are mathematical equations allowing us to understand the phenomenon. And it turns out that if the density is above a certain critical density, that means the distances between cars are small, then even the slightest variations in the speeds of cars will be amplified, because the next driver is responding with some delay that has to be compensated, so he will tip the brake a little bit harder. That amplifies the variation of speed. And there will be a chain reaction because the second next driver also has to brake, and so on, braking even harder, and in the end, people get stopped, although nobody wants this to happen. So we are confronted with a situation where everyone is well educated, the driver's license, has good technology, all the information it takes, and still the system gets out of control and something happens that nobody wants to happen against best intentions. This is kind of the characteristic feature of unstable systems. And we see that, unfortunately, also in other kinds of systems, in particular in complex networks, where we can have not just domino effects, but cascade effects that spread and create something like chain reactions. Take this example. Here we have a local perturbation. And because of the interaction in the system, this local perturbation can eventually mess up the entire system through cascade effects. This experiment is often used to demonstrate chain reaction as we have them in nuclear power stations. And we know we can control these kind of chain reactions, but it's difficult to control them. And sometimes they get out of hand, as, for example, Chernobyl or Fukushima have shown us. So certainly, we must make sure that these systems don't get out of control. It turns out that many of the systems that we're having today are networked, and some of them are global networks, and that we're always running into the same kinds of problems. Here, you can see basically blackouts all over Europe, triggered by switching off a single line. Of course, that was simulated on a computer beforehand, but another line basically failed, and that hasn't been taken into account, and so things got out of control. We've seen similar blackouts also in North America, and we have seen this in the financial system, where basically the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers triggered off a cascade of bankruptcies. So over time, hundreds of banks defaulted, causing losses of hundreds of billions of dollars. So we should certainly build systems in a different way so that these things couldn't happen again. In fact, Dirk Helbing from the Bank of England identified the increased connectivity in the banking system as a root cause of these kinds of cascade effects. And we've shown in another simulated system of epidemic spreading, and actually adding a few additional links like airline connections can push a system to a limit where local epidemics can turn global. Things get even worse by interdependencies between systems. Networks of networks are even more vulnerable in a sense. So if we have a blackout of the electrical grid, that will affect our transportation systems, it will affect our communication systems, our water supply, and much more. And so it turns out that by now, basically all our systems are interdependent, and that creates, according to the World Economic Forum, a hyper-connected world in which actually now social and economic risks have become the biggest risks for our societies. Further on, we're living in an age where we're producing, in some sense, too much data and too much speed. We're exposed to a big data tsunami. Within just 1 year, you're producing as many data as in 2,000 years of human history. So the question is, how is this impacting our systems? And here is an example. The flash crash on May 6, 2010 evaporated $600 billion within just 20 minutes of time. So that might have crashed our entire financial system if that had come at another time. Fortunately, the system recovered quickly, but we've seen many crashes since. So what does the digital revolution mean for us? Apparently, we have connected the world more and more. The networking has not just created fantastic new opportunities like new services, new functions, and so on. It's also creating new risks and challenges. And we also need to be aware that computers will eventually reach the level of the human brain within maybe 10 or 15 years. That means a lot of the jobs that humans are doing today will be done by computers, by algorithms, or by robots. And we can expect that this is going to change our society. I'll come back to this later on. By now, we know that computers are better than the best chess players in the world, that they're beating people in quiz shows. And IBM has just invested another $1 billion in order to use this system for all sorts of applications, including customer hotlines. So you have a telephone hotline call to learn something about a device you've bought and you cannot operate it, you might talk to Watson actually, and he might do that better than anyone else. So you can imagine this is really going to change our economy. And we're entering a situation where we're basically seeing a new sector of society on the rise, the digital sector. So we all started off as an agricultural society. And by now, however, there are just 3 or 5% of jobs in this sector. So one day, the steam engine was invented, and that basically created the industrialization. So the industrial sector came up. But it's already on the decline. Then public schools were introduced, and that was probably an important precondition for the service sector to rise. But now, basically, the digital society is coming up. And it might come with hiccups because the transitions between these different kinds of organization of our society has often come with problems. So we have to prepare ourselves for the transitions to come. And we may actually see a transition from agricultural to industrial society. In Africa, we'll see transitions from industrial to the service society, maybe in China, and we'll see transitions from the service society to digital societies, probably in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, and some other countries as well. So we need to think about these systems and what the digital revolution really means for us. The new world will probably follow different kinds of rules given by those digital systems. And first of all, we need to have more resilient systems as a resilient society. And what does that mean? First of all, we have to be aware of these drivers of systemic risk and reducing redundancies, save costs, more networking, higher complexity, faster dynamics, and so on. On the other hand, we are not helpless. We cannot come up with backup strategies, plan Bs. The question is, do we have that for our financial system? What is the backup financial system? I'd like to learn more about that. Then certainly simplification, less connectivity, diversity, real-time feedback and control. All of this, and also dynamic decoupling strategies are highly important, but also awareness and collective intelligence. Because I do think that we're entering an age of collective intelligence. Now, certainly, we're not helpless in terms of being exposed to this, because we are also given much better tools at hand. So, by now, we have big data about human activities, and the question is, how could we use these data to come up with better solutions and solve our problems? And how should we use this data? In a top-down way or in a bottom-up way? So let's start with top-down. Can we basically create a crystal ball using all the data? If we had it in one place, could we know everything that's going on in the world? Could we know that even in advance? And in fact, some people think that's possible. Certainly, there are bigger and bigger data volumes all the time. And so, could we get something like a God's eye view, seeing everything in the world? I'm not talking about ethical implications here at the moment, certainly interesting to discuss. But let's put ourselves in the position of a government. What would it do? It would probably try to do the best possible job that it can do with these new opportunities. So could we enable with these data a wise king who knows everything, can take the optimal decisions and then implement them in our society, thereby overcoming irrational decision-making, partial interests, and so on. So would that enable a benevolent dictatorship that would be good for society? Some people may not like the idea, but if that's better, so just consider that for a moment. Would that work? And certainly, we would have to be able not only to understand what's going on in the world and predict what's going on, we should also be able to control what's happening. But knowledge is power, as we say, so if we knew everything, could we be almighty? Could we be all-powerful? That's kind of the question. For this, we would have to be able to manipulate people's choices. And in fact, you could think about ways of manipulating people's decisions by personalized information recommendations, and maybe that's happening already. So, would that work? Would that do a perfect job? Well, probably we don't have such a tool yet, because otherwise we wouldn't have run into that much trouble in Afghanistan and Iraq. We wouldn't have had a financial crisis, most likely. We had foreseen the Arab Spring. We wouldn't have a terrible situation that we see in Syria. And we would have been better prepared for unrest and also international tensions as there happened in different parts of the world, and recently in Ukraine, you know. And so, why don't we have better tools? Is it that the crystal ball and the magic wand just can't work as perfectly as we would hope? Well, in fact, there are a number of really fundamental problems that are standing in the way, and which I think cannot be fully overcome. And one of these problems is that good risks and bad risks that we would like to separate from each other are usually not well separated. So basically, dogs are on top of each other. So if we divide them into two parts, basically, we'll have false positives, we'll have false negatives. We don't want this, but it will happen. And we might also use wrong kinds of models that creates errors of certain kind. So I do think we should use big data, but we need to use them in a very careful way. There is another problem, which is sensitivity. So basically, you determine the parameters of a model. We can never do that exactly. There's always a confidence interval. But while you vary parameters within that confidence interval, it happens that some models are very sensitive to this, and we get completely different outcomes. So if we're working with opinion technologies, we're one of the most modern fabrication fabs for silicon makers, but they had difficulties getting high throughputs with their production machines. And so they made a lot of measurements, but basically the measurements were not predicted. They made a very bad job. I'd like to recommend you to have a look at the Wikipedia page on the Netflix challenge. It turned out that it took years to become 10%, just 10% better than kind of the usual approach that would take to fit the data. That was a big data challenge. You could win $1 million. Many teams have participated in this. And it turned out that combining the best solution with a solution that was worse created a better solution. So, highly counterintuitive. And it also ended with some people suing the company actually for a privacy violation. So you can learn a lot from this Netflix example. Further on, complex systems have just limits of predictability. We know that from weather forecasts, and even if we had sensors every square meter, it wouldn't help because of the nature of turbulent flows, as we're seeing them here. The slightest change in the initial condition over time will produce something very different, a phenomenon called the butterfly effect. Now certainly, we'd like to control this complexity. That's our thinking. And forcing a complex system to behave in a certain way, however, turns out to be often counterproductive. And we often don't have enough knowledge actually to do that well. So a typical problem is you're trying to change a system, so you're changing a parameter, and then for some time nothing happens. So the measure is ineffective, so you say, okay, we have to try harder, you push the system to this point, and basically what happens is suddenly it's changing in unexpected ways. We call that a phase transition or a systemic shift. Or take this example, it's kind of a simulated ecological system, and you want the system to get here, but it's actually driven there. So these kinds of problems occur in complex systems. We have to be aware of them. And I think it's interesting to discover that the most effective measure to increase airplane safety was not better technology, but to create a non-hierarchical culture in the cockpit. So the co-pilot was actually encouraged to question what the pilot was doing. Further on, attempts to control complexity are often ineffective and costly. So we now have hundreds of thousands of regulations. It started off with 4 laws a year, 100 years back in the UK. Now we have every few hours new regulations in place. And of course, it's expensive to enforce these new regulations, so we need institutions for this. And managers and many other people are complaining about over-regulation resulting from this. But besides, it's very expensive. So most industrialized countries now have public debt levels of 100% or even 200 or more percent of GDP. So when should we ever pay that back? Can we go on like this, or are there limits to this approach? Well, certainly we can do a better job with big data, because that enables evidence-based decision-making, and we will avoid some mistakes in this way. And so let's have a look at these 3 curves. Processing power, blue curve, is increasing such that it's doubling every 18 months. Data volumes is increasing even faster, the green curve shows that. Doubles about every 12 months or 13. And systemic complexity, however, because of the combinatorial possibilities, is increasing even faster. So what does that imply actually for the possibility to govern complex systems? Well, we're basically going from a situation where we didn't have enough data to take good decisions towards a situation where you can use big data for evidence-based decision-making, so that would create super governments in some sense, better governments, so waiting for this. And however, eventually the systemic complexity would overtrump all of this, our ability to process the data, and so most likely top-down control would fail, at least for the anti-hard problems. And so the question is there a different approach? And in fact there is. We could go towards distributed control. So you could ask, is that a last battle against complexity? Do we need to give up? And my answer is, of course, no. We need to change our way of thinking. As the level of complexity goes up, we need to have a higher level of autonomy to reach our goals. And that basically means that in our hierarchically organized systems, higher levels should not do what could be done well on lower levels. So they shouldn't do as much as they can, but they should empower the lower levels to take good decisions and coordinated decisions. And it also means that one should take a minimally invasive approach, as we have learned about it in chaos control, where you have to step in just very few times and very little, but you need to know when and where. So I think we are currently seeing a paradigm shift in the way we go about these problems. And say, in disaster response management, we're probably going away from this strict hierarchy where somebody is telling the inferior levels, you have to do this, and those who are telling others, you do this, towards a situation where the government says, okay, we need to do this and this and this, and then some stakeholders and citizens and whoever says, I can do this, I can do that, no, I can help. Now, we have to recognize that in a quickly changing world, politics and business becomes increasingly similar to disaster response management. So once we have fixed one problem, there are typically two new ones. And so basically, I think we can learn from disaster response management. Now, is there some evidence for what I'm saying? I think yes, in fact, because we are seeing already a trend to decentralized bottom-up approaches everywhere, because it's more efficient. So we have been investing a lot into telematics approaches, but now we're talking much more about communicating in cars. That means local interactions, decentralized control. We see peer-to-peer money becoming more interesting, even becoming more valuable than gold. We see peer-to-peer lending coming up. We also see our peer review system in science change. We see that taxi stands are challenged by Uber. Well, we see that human supervised driving is being replaced by Google's self-driving car. The companies also have such cars. And we're now going from single robots to intelligent swarms. And also, the military has recognized the power of this approach. And one of the best examples, actually, for such a bottom-up system that basically operates like an ecosystem is probably the Silicon Valley. And our immune system, because that's not steered by a brain or a centralized human. It's organized, highly decentralized, but it's highly effective in protecting us for a century, basically, from external threats. So we can learn from this. And so what do we need to do? Well, we can certainly build new instruments to understand and explore the world. And Future ICT came up with a number of proposals. So first of all, to come up with what we call the cognitive nervous system that would measure the world in real time, not just the physical world and the biological environment, but also our society and our economy. And maybe local measurements, but we would enable real-time feedback. We would need for the self-regulating system that I'm going to talk about, we need to create new interaction mechanisms enabling that self-regulation. That requires an innovation accelerator. Then we'd like to test these mechanisms for their feasibility and for their implications. And that requires what we call the Living Earth simulator, or also interactive virtual worlds. And finally, once all of that has been done, we could kind of implement these self-regulating systems in real life, and that basically requires participatory platforms. If you want to learn more about this, please have a look at the Future ICT blog. I'm starting out with the cognitive nervous system, and I'll show you in particular that tailored measurements are better than data mining of big data and machine learning. And in fact, Google Sutrans was supposed to be one of the prime examples for the power of big data. Well, it has recently been criticized because it's not as good as we thought. So that is the big data approach. We've recently pursued a different approach, where basically we're working with the reported cases of the World Health Organization. Now, if we look at the spreading of diseases, it really looks chaotic. It doesn't seem to make any sense. And that's reflected in these widely scattered data clouds over here. Why is that? Because airline traffic messes up everything. It creates really complex dynamical patterns. However, it turns out that using the knowledge about the travel volumes versus airplanes can be used to define a new effective distance. And that gives a much clearer picture. Now suddenly we have linear dependencies, and we're able to determine the outbreak location, because now we have these circular spreading patterns, and the most circular pattern identifies as the outbreak location, which is often not known in the beginning. And then once you know the outbreak location, given a circular spreading pattern, you can also predict what are the cities that are most likely to be hit next by the flu wave. So we think that can be a much more powerful approach, and it basically means that best data that's combined with a model can do a much better job than big data that is kind of claimed to be the universal tool, but that it apparently isn't. So we need to have tailored measurements. And for this, we'd like to build a learn to know the system. And in fact, we could do that using mobile phones, so we should do that in a privacy-respecting way. And the idea is that we could actually get a picture of what's happening out in the world. And in particular, we could measure social capital like reputation, solidarity, or also we could measure happiness and other things in real time in almost any place of the world, and quite cheaply. Now consider that social capital is actually a precondition for economic well-being, so a lot of economic activity builds on this, but it's kind of the invisible fabric of our society. With these tools, we can make it visible, and we can understand the forces that shape our social and economic world. And we can probably detect a number of risks that would be out there. We can, in particular, understand, for example, the spreading of tension between countries. So, as you can see over here, in 2001, there was international tension induced by the Iraq War, but that eventually affected many countries in the neighborhood. And one of the questions that we are asking ourselves now is, has that contributed to destabilizing the entire region to an extent that it also enabled the Arab Spring? And I don't have an answer at the moment, but this is certainly one of the questions that we need to look into to understand better what's happening in the world and why. So, I already indicated these tools will allow us to see the social fabric and understand the underlying forces that are shaping society and are either creating success or failure. And we've had a number of examples where we have explicitly demonstrated that. Pedestrian flows, for example, can be very well understood with force models, as we have demonstrated many times. And these forces can even be measured. That's kind of the most surprising thing. We didn't think that in the beginning, but by now it's possible, and it had really useful implications for improving the safety of crowds, for example, during the Hajj. So there were many measures that were taken to avoid the crowd disasters that had happened in the past. In particular, avoid crossing and counterflows, but also have real-time monitoring and adaptive response strategies, and contingency plans, of course, to mention just a few of the things. And so that changed the situation from a quite chaotic situation where emergency vehicles couldn't actually reach the people in need towards an ordered situation that the pilgrims liked and has so far avoided for the crowded sausage. Another example is actually traffic flows. Look at these complex patterns. To be honest, if I had seen them in the beginning when I started to do traffic signs, I would probably have given up right away and said, hey, let's look for a simpler problem to work on. But astonishingly enough, over time we were able to understand these patterns. So they're made up from elementary congestion patterns, which can be actually analytically understood. So there's an analytical theory for this. Great success for complexity theory. We can understand the conditions under which different kinds of patterns are emerging theoretically. So we do have an understanding, and this understanding is even predictive in the sense that we can predict the extension of congestion patterns and the delay times implied by those. So we can understand complex systems, and I'll show later on that we can also overcome the problems that occur in them by this understanding. So let's come to the Living Earth simulator, and the purpose of this is not to create a crystal ball, but to make us aware of opportunities and risks and design better manageable systems. So certainly we can try to combine the models that we've developed for traffic, production, for social behavior, and so on. We're trying to scale them up and to increase the degree of detail. Certainly, in the beginning, that wouldn't work very well, as it happened for weather forecasts. But in fact, over time, it could become a useful tool, even though it will only do short-term and probabilistic forecasts, and it will be wrong many times. But we know having a weather forecast is useful, and every dollar we invest into these kind of systems creates a multiple benefit. So it would be for these kind of systems. And we've actually worked on examples such as the resilience of the European gas supply. Started that 2 years back, and then suddenly when the paper came out, and it was just at the time where that became a political issue. So we have basically combined different kinds of data sets, but also combined that with the model, because the idea was if one of the regions, basically Northern Africa, Russia, and Scandinavia, that are delivering gas through the pipeline network, one of these regions doesn't deliver anymore for whatever reasons, a third, basically, of the deliveries will not be available, and we'll have to handle that. And probably we would need to have a fair solution so everyone can survive with that situation, and the system stays operational. We can actually come up also with improvements of the power grid, and what is really important for all network systems that we have engineered breaking points in place to stop cascade effects. Now, we have that at home, everyone, so a local overload would not make our house burn down. But apparently we didn't have that in place in our financial system, in some other systems. So I think by the collaboration of economists, social scientists, engineers, natural scientists, we can build these engineered breaking points and in this way create much better systems. We can also understand conflict as it happened in the Middle East. We have developed an agent-based model that takes into account culture, and in fact the distance between cultures is the main explanatory variable over here. Now, one interesting point is actually that conflict somehow results from the attempt to create social order. You wouldn't think this. So we certainly need to have a new way of thinking about conflict. The good thing about these models is that they allow us to look into counterfactuals. I mean, political scenarios under discussion. We have done that for a number of plans. And all those plans apparently would be better than leaving things as they are. They would reduce conflict levels quite a bit. So, but what is really exciting for me is that we can now build these self-regulating systems. And the idea is quite old, actually, 300 years old. So we've seen the beehives and the ant colonies and all this, and some people say, okay, why can't our society work that way? Organized so beautifully by local interactions. Actually, a beehive has a queen, but it just lays eggs. It doesn't tell all the other bees what to do. And still it works beautifully. So how does it work? And Adam Smith is known for the invisible hand. And we have seen many patterns in nature where it just works beautifully. Unfortunately, humans are more complex than that. They're actually much more diverse, and this diversity is actually one of our key advantages as compared to other species, because that drives innovation and cultural evolution. But we cannot handle that well so far. So the invisible hand, unfortunately, often fails to do a good job. So we have all these tragedies of the commons, such as environmental exploitation, overfishing, or environmental pollution, where you don't have bad intentions and to want to destroy the world for this to happen. It's actually a similar phenomenon to the phantom traffic jam that I showed before. Nobody wants this to happen, but it still happens because the desirable state is unstable. Here, exactly the same thing. We're confronted with these social dilemma problems where cooperation would be good for everyone, but everyone wants to make a little bit less of a contribution and get a little bit more out of the system, and that destabilizes cooperation. It erodes and creates these strategies of the common. So could we solve these problems? Could we fix our systems? And the answer is yes. 300 years later, the Internet of Things will empower us to create self-regulating systems and to make an invisible hand work. So basically, the sensor networks that are now becoming available empower us to do the real-time measurements that we need for the real-time feedbacks. And in fact, we have demonstrated in our work with Volkswagen that it's possible to overcome annoying traffic jams. Just suppose that this car and all the cars are equipped with radar sensors that measure distance and relative velocity, and the car would automatically respond to that kind of information. And in fact, by changing slightly the driving style, we call it mechanism design, changing the interaction mechanism, we can allow the cars to overcome congestion. So it would go away. Now, importantly, self-regulation is resource efficient and resilient. So for this, let's compare three ways of organizing our system. Top-down control, as we have it in many traffic centers today. So collecting all the data you can get, you try to optimize the traffic light control, and then you implement it on the entire city. So like a benevolent dictator. Trying to do the best job for everyone. Then let's look at the bottom-up self-organization, a la Adam Smith. Now, each intersection now is assumed to minimize separately from the other intersections the travel times of all the cars approaching the intersection. You could call it a home economics. Everybody is trying to do the best thing, locally. And here we do the same thing, but whenever a queue grows long, we would prioritize it. So we would first clear this queue in order to avoid spillover effect. So that's kind of other regarding. It has an eye on what happens to the neighbors, but it's still a local control. So how does that perform? So first, top-down regulation. As the capacity utilization of the intersection goes up, we see that the queue length grows. But that's naturally, that's expected. Now let's see how this selfish local optimization, Homo economicus, performs. And it creates a self-organization, a coordination of traffic flows, and much better. Yeah? Much better. Queue lengths are shorter. However, while the invisible hand phenomenon works over here at low capacity utilization, suddenly here we have an explosion of the queue lengths and the self-organized coordination fails. So Adam Smith's invisible hand fails. And now the top-down control is actually better now. That's why the traffic centers ask, okay, you need us. But then there is another regarding local optimization, self-regulation approach, and it turns out that it's better all the way. It's actually the best solution. So we can make the invisible hand work. And you can see that it creates beautiful green waves in the system. And that means coordination happens by self-organization. And this coordination spreads all over the system, which makes it so efficient. So it's good for all the different modes of transport, and it's good for the environment as well. So why don't we just do it? Now, one of the questions is, can we extend this principle from technological systems to our economy and to our society? And in fact, Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom has shown exactly this. She has studied real-life examples showing that self-governance is working and is efficient, given proper design principles, given the right kind of mechanism. So what would be mechanisms for a globalized world? And I believe that reputation systems and meritocratic matching can provide institutional frameworks to overcome tragedies of the commons and create societal benefits. So that's actually the reason why we see this quick spreading of reputation systems all over the web, because it's useful. In fact, it's good for the customers because they get a better service. And it's also good for the sellers because if they have a good reputation, they can sell their products at a higher price. So it's good for everyone. Let's just do that everywhere. Then very recently we have discovered a very surprising effect that basically if you have a public goods game played in groups, and match groups according to the level of contribution that they're giving into the system, then it creates new solutions, an unstable and a stable one, and it creates a trend actually towards high cooperation. So by giving more, you get more. That's really magic. And this, I think, will really be important for the way we're going to organize future markets. Now, global participator platform, why is this important? Because I think we need to empower people to do better decisions and take more effective actions. And the need of more participation is not because everyone in all the countries of the world says we want to have more participation. The reason is that this follows from the need of having more distributed control as the complexity of the system goes up. Because it becomes more and more complicated for top-down management to satisfy everyone with all those diverse needs. So just help people to help themselves, enable them, create opportunities and options. And actually, this is also happening. The social media are doing exactly this. They're creating infrastructure to help people coordinate their interests, and probably will use them much more also for economic applications. In fact, there's also a paradigm shift that consumers are turning into prosumers, who are kind of co-producing, and this is partially enabled also by new technologies like 3D printers. So, self-organization and self-regulation are approaches which can master the complexity of today's systems and can benefit from it. And it means basically go away from this approach of top-down micromanagement, where we try to say every single person and company what exactly to do, in what order. And probably people would fail to do that because it's becoming too complicated. Towards such an approach, come up with institutional designs that support people in doing the right thing. And there's such a beautiful movie, unfortunately, which is also not playing here, but have a look at one of my other YouTube presentations, and we'll see at this intersection there's a wonderful self-organization going on. So all the different participants, be pedestrians, cyclists, car drivers, or even camel riders, they don't have to stop because they're always finding a gap in the traffic flow when they arrive. Why is that? Because of the design. We have unidirectional flow over here, another unidirectional flow over there. So it's easy to cross this. And there is a buffer in here which allows you to adapt your speed such that you arrive just at the point in time when a gap opens up for you. And I think a lot of what I'm talking about is actually happening to a large extent in Switzerland. It has this basic democracy, and it has a number of really interesting governance principles. And so, given that Switzerland is really a very successful society and economy given its size, why don't we basically scale up these success principles and turn that into technology for the world? So I'm concluding by saying we need a joint global effort to master the global 21st century challenges and build a framework for the emerging digital society. Let's do that together. Thank you very much.
We have time for a couple of questions before we break up. Any questions?
Yeah, please tell us.
So the Industrial Revolution enabled us to spend less time physically working. So I'm wondering if the things that you're proposing in the future, at some point, we will no longer have to think.
Well, I believe we'll probably spend less thinking on those things that really don't require us to do the job. I just think of all the tedious work that's part of our work today, filling in forms and all that stuff. That could probably be done better by computers in the future. So we could focus on the really important things and be more creative, more innovative. And this is what I believe is going to happen. Yeah, any other question or comment? Yes, please.
Wonderful job, thank you. I thought it was very interesting, the chart you showed on the queuing, the different ways of organizing the queue. At the very high capacity utilization, though, all these curves merge together and you still get jammed. And at that point, what you need is more capacity in the system, right?
Yeah.
So my question is, in the end, all this digital self-regulation happens on top of a physical infrastructure. Roads, airports, water pipes. And it seems that, in some sense, is there a model other than top-down for creating the physical backbone in this very high capacity utilization regime? How can we marry up top-down infrastructure building with this bottom-up idea of self-regulation?
Yeah, there's interesting research going on about how cities evolve. And people have been looking into this, how much is really decided in a top-down way and how much is happening in a bottom-up way. And it turns out that there were a number of genius architects and people who came up with designed for cities, for entire cities, and it never worked out well. So in practice, all the cities have a high level of self-organization, which is part of it. And it's very important. Now, there are different ways, by the way, to use our infrastructure, and I think we're not always using it in the best possible way. Observe, for example, in Egypt that there were 3 lanes, but when things became busy, they were just having 5 cars next to each other, and you could do that because the speed was low, right? So that was an adaptive use of the capacity. Of course, with information technology, we could do that much better, and with much less noise, as you'll find it in a city like Cairo. I also think that the way we're operating the infrastructure has not been optimized. So what I'd like to do one day basically is look at, okay, given the streets that we have, the capacities that we have, what if we turn this 2-lane road into a 1-lane road, and all sorts of things. Now, just systematically vary all the possibilities and figure out how much capacity we can gain by this. And I think actually quite a lot, most likely, because network systems create so many constraints, and many of those come with minimum functions. So whenever you do a little thing wrong, you just have the minimum performance. Yeah? So basically, by kicking out as many minimum functions as possible, we'll get much more capacity. Another point, I think we're also getting towards more bottom-up creation of infrastructure with 3D printers. People are now even talking about kind of printing, maybe printing is the right word, but building houses with monstrous 3D printers, basically within a day or a very short time. So I think there will be dramatic changes also in the infrastructural area.
Most of the people at this meeting are from universities, European universities. You can't speculate on how you think all of this will change universities, which have been very, very stable change over time.
How this will change universities? To be honest, I believe the digital revolution will change most of our institutions. Maybe not the church, but basically everything else, including education. Certainly now we're seeing these massive online courses. I don't think this is kind of the optimal and final solution. I think we need to have interactiveness. And so we'll probably have virtual worlds, interactive virtual worlds to learn about physical laws and all sorts of things. We'll have reward mechanisms built in, like scoring systems. We'll have opportunities to ask, to experiment, and so on. So a lot of education will happen in the virtual space. I think also we need to go away from trying to educate everyone the same way, because that's killing a lot of creativity. What we need to have in the future is more creativity, because everything else possibly can be done by computers and robots better than we can do. So that has fundamental implications for the way schools are built. We see that our financial systems are changing, payment systems, insurance systems. We see that in the military system, things are changing, talking now about cyber wars, not for a long time actually. All systems, I think, will be changing. And that's why it's right, I believe, to talk about the digital society as a new phase after agricultural society, industrial and service society. We should think about this as a different world, even if the infrastructure may look similar, the way we are operating it will change dramatically, and the digital world has certain kind of implications that mean that many things will work in different ways, and we need to understand this new logic because that has fundamental implications for leadership and the operation of systems in the future. In fact, we have to learn to think in a different way. And that comes back again to education. So we need to educate people to think differently. Why? Because today our thinking is very much component-oriented. So we think of heroes, of criminals, of genius scientists, whatever, as single people doing certain things. While almost everything that's happening today is interconnected, dependent on social and economic influences around us. And if you want to understand politics, innovation, crime, conflict, and almost anything that comes to your mind, we need to have a systemic perspective. We need to go from a component to an interaction-oriented view of this. And I believe that could be a change in thinking as dramatic as the change from flat Earth to the Earth as a globe, or from the basically picture where the Earth was seen to be in the center of the world to the heliocentric worldview, or also the way Darwin changed our picture of the role of human in our society. In fact, we are now building these intelligent computers and robots, and we're kind of pushing ourselves away from this position of the most intelligent species. So again, our position in the universe will change, and I think that will change our entire thinking about the world. Yes.
You in reference to financial and governance systems earlier in your talk, and in particular certain degrees of interconnectivity, how that leads to sensitivity to change in financial crime, etc. The problem is there are also vested interests that benefit strongly from both degrees of interconnectivity and that kind of crash. And in the same way that in governance, where there are opportunities for sort of minor control to improve a system, you can turn that around to there are also opportunities for sort of minor influences to corrupt or to destroy a system. So how do we, I guess the question is, how do we use notions of complexity when there are vested interests that would very much like to undermine the stability of the governance?
Yeah, the difficult question, but I think this is one of the reasons why we do have governments to act in the public interest. Yeah, certainly we shouldn't take the risk that we may destroy the world in one way or the other. If the financial system crashes, if our internet doesn't work, if we have a global war, if we have a global pandemics, or if our environment changes dramatically. To give just some examples, that could really create conditions that are not good for anyone. That could, in the worst case, just create an Armageddon. And I think we should just not allow this to happen. We need to create systems that wouldn't allow global damage to occur. And that's why I was talking about the engineered breaking points. And the question is, can we build up this bottom-up approach complementary to the top-down approach that we have? And I think actually that can be done. I believe that cities will be very important for our societies in the world to be better prepared for the future through collaboration agreements between cities all over the world, through, for example, climate Olympics to come up with better solutions in all sorts of areas. And we were able to create platforms that allow us to organize ourselves better in the interest of the civil society. We've seen that Instagram had 30 people or so. We've seen WhatsApp had about 50 people in the end and made $19 billion. So, with a few handful of people, it's now possible actually to create these infrastructures, and we can do that.
So we can continue the discussions and questions during the break. Let's take a break for 30 minutes. We're going to start our